All right. So let's jump straight into this story building session. So let's jump in. So what is behavior interviewing? So what we actually say is that behavior interviewing is whatever you've done in the past. Your behavior in the past is more likely than not an accurate predictor or high fidelity signal about what you can do in the future. So what you might be able to do in the future. And what that means is that the last time there was like a bear in front of you, and if you ran, more likely than not, if you see a bear again, you'll probably gonna run, right? Unless you have like some significant learning or you've actually grown beyond what happened. Close the. So unless there's been like some significant learning. So typically when you're talking about your experiences, you want to talk about here's what happened. Like, one of the behavior interviewing questions is about tell me more about your failures. And what that means is that here's all the circumstances that led to the failure. But the way you want to narrate that is to say, I have learned from that failure, which means that the next time something similar happens, I think I know better, and I can definitely do a better job. So that's like the message that you want to convey there, right? So let's figure out like what would be like a common behavior interview question. So here are like a few. Well, a typical thing that you would see is that like a dead giveaway is like it will be like, tell me about a time when, can you think of an example, can you share a scenario when, a situation when. It's almost always something that's reflecting on the past things that you've done, and it is almost always like asking you to figure out like, tell me more about what happened, how did it happen, and the why and whatever behind it. So here are a few examples. Give an example of where you met a significant goal and exceeded it. And what are we trying to figure out? What do you think? What's the objective of the first question? Like, you met, tell me about a time when you met a significant goal and you exceeded it. What do you think they're trying to ask? I mean, they're trying to figure that out, but what would be the message behind the message? Like, what are they trying to get to?
Are you good at showing initiatives?
Mm-hmm. The how part of it is what they're looking at, right? So how did you meet the goal? What were the goals? How did you understand the goals? And did you and the mechanisms? Like, what were the mechanisms that you used for that? Which is, did I show initiative? Was I more thorough? Was I like, did I actually spend more time? And just like, went above and beyond, but that's like just more quantity as opposed to like, some smartness and things like that. So they're trying to figure out all those aspects in questions.
Because I think goal is more of what your responsibilities are.
Mm-hmm.
I think they want to know if you've exceeded that, if you've gone beyond that.
This is one of the very few places where I've actually seen this kind of being articulated as such. Mm-hmm. So pretty much like in an interview, the interviewer would ask you, so did you meet the goal? Do you think you met the goal? Or, tell me, like, what does it mean to exceed the goal? So in your mind, when you talk about a goal, you need to have a calibration of what does it mean to not meet the goal, and exceed the goal. And when would you say you exceeded the goal? Sometimes it's very numeric, so you can say that I expected to get like, $100,000 of sales and you got like 150, that's exceeding the goal. Sometimes it's actually faster, so I expected to do it in December, but I actually did it in August or something like that. So there are a few ways you can actually exceed, and how you did it is something that will actually be interesting. And sometimes it's okay to be on time and meet the goal, you don't have to necessarily exceed the goal. All right, let's actually look at the other one as well. Like, tell me about a time when you had to make an unpopular decision. Like when, how? Like what are you looking for?
Ability to build consensus, like influence other people.
Mm-hmm. So looking for influence, consensus. Go ahead.
Thinking outside the box.
Thinking outside the box. How would thinking outside the box fit in this one? It does, but how? Can you help connect the dots?
And it's not going where everyone is going, like having a different perspective of what everyone will do.
Mm-hmm. So one of the thing is like here is around this is around consensus building, which also means that at times you have to think out of the box, figure out why are people thinking the way they're thinking, why is there a broad disagreement in the first place, and then essentially try to figure out how to make that work. The other thing, of course, is did you pull rank? Did you actually kind of just say it's an unpopular decision, nobody wants it, but you know what, we have to do cost cutting, we have to do whatever else that is actually required, which is not something that people would want to do. Right? So, moving on to the next one is like, when did you overcome, like, give me an example of when you actually had to overcome a significant challenge. Hey, just grab a spot. Alright, so again the question is like, give me an example of where you had to overcome a significant challenge. And this is the one is, at pretty much all parts of the story is you're looking at what was the challenge, why did you do it, what did you do, what were the motivations, what were the options in front of you and things like that. And you need a good structured way of actually presenting the story. The questions are great. Now let's find out like how do we actually take that information, how do we assemble this information and then pass it on to the interviewer. And at the end of the day, the goal is to essentially communicate the story back to the interviewer. So, pretty common format that is used is, I think there's something called SOAR, which is another format, but STAR is like most commonly used. I've seen it in multiple interview forums and formats. STAR essentially stands for like 4 things: situation, task, action, and results. In a nutshell, you're just talking about like what happened, what is the problem statement, like what are you trying to solve, what was the issue, something happened and I'm trying to do something, which is basically saying that, well, all the printers in the network went offline, that was the problem. All right, so what was the task? And we had to go find out why, we had to debug, we had to go check each floor, see which ones worked, which one didn't work, what happened, and we kind of discovered that, well, you know what, there was some firmware bug that was there and that actually knocked it off. Great, so what was your specific role? You're talking about the task is like a big manifest of everything that needed to be done, which is of course like it's never a solo job in most cases, so it's almost always you're working in a team. So the goal here is to find out what was it that you did versus what was it the rest of the folks did. And it's very critical that you're able to accurately call out what your contribution is. And very often what I've seen is that I've seen people sometimes claim credit for what others have done. And in some scenarios, they actually only talk about what we did as a together collectively, and they struggle to specifically talk about what their contribution was. And the interviewers generally do a good job of extracting that, but sometimes they don't. So you don't want to be at the mercy of a good interviewer to perform better in an interview. So by actually structuring your responses in the STAR format, you are essentially making it so much easier for the interviewer to consume the data and essentially make their decision. Of course, the last thing is results. So while you talk about STAR, the situation, this is what I did, here's what happened. What ended up happening? Like, did you actually succeed? Did you fail? And it is okay to succeed or fail, but preferably pick stories which are actually more meaningful and more successful. Why STAR? Like why do it in the STAR format? What's the advantage, right? So the first one is essentially STAR gives a way of providing a holistic picture of what happened and why and whatnot. Like if you simply were to say that, give me an example of when you did an amazing job, it's like, yeah, we launched something, and I'm like, okay, so why is that a big deal? What did you launch? Was that something super big, or was just you pushed a button and things happened? How complicated it is. The picture is not clear, then the interviewer will actually spend time digging in and digging deeper and getting that information. It sort of works, but typically it's much easier for you to provide the entire context, so that's fantastic. The second thing is it also provides your experience and your individual skills and context. So specifically for folks, and almost all of us come from completely different and diverse backgrounds. So if you've been working in embedded systems and you're interviewing with a company which is doing services, there's almost no good way for them to know, hey, you solved this one bug and shaved off 10 nanoseconds from some process. They're like, yeah, so what's the big deal? But you know what? Apparently that's probably a big deal. You never know. So you have to be able to provide why is this a big deal? What's going on? So that's where the story comes in. The STAR format helps you actually call out, here's the task, here's all the problem statement that's around it, and here's the quantification of success. The other thing, of course, is purpose of the interview. Once the interview is done, what happens? The interviewer actually takes notes, writes everything down. He or she would go have a conversation or write things down and submit it to some kind of a central forum. Different companies do different format. Amazon has a debrief style format where they all get together in a room. Google and Facebook actually have this written down narrative format where it actually goes there. Microsoft, I believe, it's kind of people pass messages and IM is what I've heard, but anything happens, I don't know. So everybody follows a different process, okay, there you go. So different companies have a different process, more companies that have been doing a lot of interviews have actually evolved a process into something that works for them, but most companies actually are still pretty ad hoc. The more sticky your story is and more memorable your story is, the better it is. I mean, you can actually, you talk about what happened and how, and then that if the interviewer is able to recollect exactly what happened. Some of the interviews that I remember a lot are when I see a fascinating problem statement and the candidate has done something fantastic and they've actually gotten an answer out of it saying this is what they did. And as the candidate is talking about the problem statement, I am actually trying to solve it in my head as well. And then I'm like, yeah, here's the list of things we should do to solve it. And then that maps to what they say, great. And then they solve it, and then suddenly they come up with something which is innovative or different, and then I start liking it. I'm actually engaged in that conversation. So by providing it in the flow of things and actually not making the interviewer do the extra mile of asking you questions to extract the story, I think you'll come out ahead. One thing to remember is this is a story or it's a narrative. So you're looking at a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that kind of maps to the start thing we talked about. Like, what was the situation? Is like, here is what we set out to accomplish. What was the action? What did I do? What did he do? What did she do? And then the end is essentially your result. Like, this is the outcome. What happened with that? Right? Any questions so far before we just start diving into each part of it?
Question basically, if you have a really good story, it's pretty easy to convey to make yourself very effective.
Right.
So if you're done for the past couple of years, a pretty boring task. For example, fixing bugs for this X product which nobody cares about. But you definitely know this particular task requires a tremendous amount of input. How do you phrase, how do you story it? I mean, I basically see storytelling as a way to not just present an awesome stuff that you have done in an awesome way, but the stuff that you have over here is not like a fascinating,
Fantastic. Let me just repeat that so that all of us can hear this. That I think the thing was that if you have a great story, you know what, you've cured an incredible disease, you've actually solved something, launched a rocket. Very easy to actually narrate that story, right? Now you've talked about scale, you've talked about a whole bunch of things. It's much easier for you to talk through the whole thing. But what if you've done something like super trivial or super boring, or what if I've been like all my job is essentially just like maintaining databases, and all I'm doing is wake up every day, check if the table space is gone. If it's gone, then I just clean up, and then I come back and go back to sleep. That's all my job is. Super mundane, super boring, like not really a whole lot of challenges. Now what do I do? How do I actually narrate? How do I actually talk about my life experiences? How do I talk about that, and how do I get there? I hold on to that question. As we go through the 4 parts of the STAR, let me talk about certain ways by which you can amp up your responses, but we'll see if that actually answers your question. If not, we'll come back. Right? Just going back. So situation, that's the first part of the thing, right? So what is the situation? I'll also take an example of like super boring, mundane job, like all I'm doing is waking up, checking the certain event logs or something, nothing happens, I have nothing else to do, right? So that's kind of what I'm looking at. Super boring. So how do I actually make a story out of it? So one of the things that you're looking at is essentially almost everything or every action there's this drama, there's like suspense, there's this mystery. So try to bring that into it. If I were to say, you know what, there was this one day I wake up 6 a.m. in the morning, alarm bells ringing, I have no idea what's going on, I don't know what happened, it looks like the dashboard's all lit up red, and this is what I had to do, and then I looked at this, I did that, I checked this is my process, this never happened ever. It's been like 2 years since any of the alarms have rung, so I have no idea why this would even happen. And guess what happened was, the data center was completely flooded with water. Whatever happened, I mean, if nothing happened, I don't know what to do, but I'm sure your life must have had some drama as far as the work is concerned. So the thing is that you're not talking about a generic job description. You're not talking about like, hey, my day job is to come in and do this, and this is what I do, run a daily scrum, talk to the engineers. It's not what I do. That's not what the goal is. Here it's actually a very specific incident. Like one day I woke up, I did this, I saw that, and this is exactly what happened. So pick an incident that actually has sufficient amount of drama in it, sufficient amount of like suspense, mystery. You have to find something, and there's a little bit of embellishment that you can actually do. Not a whole lot, because the more you embellish, the harder it is the story still has to make sense. So you can't just like randomly make things up, but you can always like extend some parts of the thing. You can compress the time frames, you can extend a little bit of it, you can omit some pieces of information, but be a little careful about what you do there. So as you narrate the story, right, one of the things that we do look at is like essentially the 5 W's and the 1 H, right? The who, what, when, where, why, and the how is essentially what you need to look at. So you're talking about this is what happened, here's when it happened, this is where people are involved, and whatnot. So the way I look at it is like anchor your story. So when you start, you just start. Like when I was giving a few examples, that's what I was saying, right? One fine day, or like 2 weeks ago, on December 15th, I woke up at this time, so I'm talking about the when. And then where, it's like, I was at the office, I did this, or in this particular office, this particular role, or whatever else. So you're talking about the who, the when and the where actually anchors in time. It's very useful as well because sometimes interviewers are okay with stories that are too far back in the past, like 15 years ago this is what happened. But then sometimes they're very iffy about it, and they want you to do something that's a little bit more recent. So they want you to pick like last 6 months, last year or so. So if you start explicit with the when and the where, then they would actually know, they can stop you and say, no, that story is not good enough, tell something else. So that's one thing to look at. The next one is, of course, provide a very complete picture of like what was the actual issue, who was there, what did they do, different roles, responsibilities, what was actually happening. The more color that you can fill in, the better it is in terms of like helping people understand the context of what's going on. Like if the same dashboard example, if I were to say that the VP was breathing on the neck and then there was a site manager was there and this was there, the engineering team was actually on standby. Those are the things that actually add color to like more drama, more color, and it also tells us like different parties involved and who was doing what is actually pretty important there as well. Then just complete the picture of with the why and the how, and the why and the how is essentially just walks into the task and action. So task and action is pretty straightforward. The task is essentially describe the full solution. Here's all it took. Here are all the pieces that were broken. Here's all the process that I had to do to fix that. So that's the full solution. And then you just talk about the complexity and the magnitude, like and the innovativeness. So what was inventive about the entire thing? This is the place where I have actually been pleasantly surprised with out-of-box thinking and things like that every now and then. Where a candidate comes up with a solution where they come and say, hey, this was the problem. I'm like, great. And then what was the solution? There's always something that's actually interesting. And that the more interesting and inventive that part of the solution is, that's what is good. Let me complete the action results and come back and address that one part that you talked about. So the next one, of course, is actions. Please separate what you did from what others did. One of the most common issues that we have in interviewing is like interviewers are typically coached to go figure out the I versus we. Typically, since you're working in corporate environments, it also sometimes has culture, like most Asian, like India, China, and then Japan, other places. People actually hesitate to take credit, and they would actually say, you know what, we did this, we did that, and things like that, and that's like, could be a cultural thing. Start using I. And the interviewers actually are trained to do that. They come in and they ask you specifically to pick apart, but again, you don't want to be at the mercy of, or like you don't want to be lucky enough to have a good interviewer to do that. The better you do in terms of, without having any prompts, if you can rightfully pick up the right framework and format, that makes more sense. The thing that to talk about as you're looking at the actions as well, one of the things that's actually playing in the interviewer's head, as I talked about in the beginning part of it, is that the interviewer is trying to form a story of your competence and your capabilities, right? And they're saying that, so if in the future we have another incident with the database with all the lights running, and that requires like the following things that need to be done, here's what this engineer would do, or here's what this manager would do, or whatever that is. So they're actually trying to make up a thing of this is how your behavior will be. Now this is the right place for you to actually reflect on some of what you did is what you did, but the why you did it also needs to be explained along with it. The more you add color to why you did that, it'll actually be a lot more easier for the interviewer to say, yeah, that makes total sense. It's like, you know what, I took a leap of faith, I just rebooted the servers and it didn't solve the problem. Next time, what I will do is I'll probably check this before I do that. So show the learning that you've had, show the growth that has actually happened based on the incident, and that will help you. And typically that is what you do for negative instances. So when you talk about give me an example of a failure, when you deliver a bad news, what was your most significant miss that happened in your career ever, and things like that. You need to have a lesson learned behind that. Why did I do it? Not because I was dumb or stupid, but because I took a judgment call and I kind of was missing some pieces, and then now I know, so now I can do that better. So that framework has to be clear because that's kind of what the interviewer is trying to see. So make it easier for them to figure it out. So last part of the story, before I break for a few questions, is the results. The results are sort of the most important part of this equation. Action's super important, the results are important as well. Very many times I see people, like interviewers, actually not pick up on the results, and that sometimes once you come to the results, everything is great, action's all good, finally what happened? Oh, nothing. I mean, we couldn't solve the issue, and that's like such a big letdown. So make sure that you have the desired outcome is achieved. make sure that you can quantify the outcome in like multiple different ways. So you actually could be talking about if you're talking about like revenue numbers, sales numbers, or something, then just talk about that in different ways, like percentage, year-over growth, total percentage, market share, market segment, a bunch of different ways you can articulate the same metric. The reason why that is important is that you will be probed and quizzed on the specific data. And what's going to happen is that if you were not involved in the activity and you were only peripherally involved, and you just like made up some numbers and say, yeah, this is what happened. Sometimes it's the specifics that's what trip people up. So one of the examples that I've had is in one of the interviews that I was in, a candidate was talking about like, hey, this is what we did, and here's what the problem was, and we were running out of like database space, and then this is what we did. We were actually storing the entire blob of data, and it was just not working. So I'm like, oh, so how big was your database? Oh, it's like a standard Oracle, this server, and there's so many terabytes of data and whatnot. Like, great. And how many days of retention did you have? I'm like, what? Like, no, like how many days was the data for? It's like, yeah, it's like 2 months. I'm like, okay. And what's the size of each blob? Because like if you're trying to do retention and all that, you should know this information, and you don't have to be precise. I mean, I don't care if it is like 1 megabyte versus 1.5 megabyte versus 3 megabytes, but the specificity and the way that the quickness with which you can actually answer is important. So the more information, which is why like embellishing is okay, but if I were to take like his story because we talked about something and I like that story, I'm going to go present in an interview. There's absolutely no way, because you will get caught. I mean, if you're lucky, you may not, but that doesn't happen that often. Most interviewers actually know how to figure out, because one is the narrative actually is now no longer linear. It's very hard for you to actually completely internalize what they've said and explain, and data is missing. So when they ask extra questions, that's why the embellishment or omission should be as minimal as possible. Every forum where I was actually looking at how to do star interviews and star format and whatnot, it's like, this is not what their message is. Their message is be honest and don't embellish, is what they say. And I'm saying, that's okay. I mean, you can always you don't have to be super direct with all of this. So think of it, right? The interviewer has no way of knowing what actually happened. Very rarely would the interviewer have like a line into your company, your organization, something that happened. You are the only person who knows the entire story. So, which is exactly what, even for if you look at any other scenario, motivational speakers and whatever else, when they actually are narrating a story, they'll say, when I was 5 years old, I did this, and it must have happened when I was 6 or 7, doesn't matter, but 5 just sounds better. So they always tweak a little. It doesn't really go off course and off message, and nobody else knows. And even if they know, they don't care. So there's some leeway that you have in terms of how much you can embellish. But if you completely borrow somebody else's story and just rip it off and try to deal with it, that will not work. Right? So going back to the thing that I was actually going back to that one, right, about the database issue and the database or the super boring job thing. Like how do you actually manage that? How do you actually work with? So what do you think? So what do you guys think? In terms of if I have a super boring job, uneventful day, every day after day. How do I narrate an interesting, memorable, funny story that somehow will make things work?
I was thinking that we can make the scope of the task really big, so that the final impact will be big, even though my action is a small part of it.
Mm-hmm.
If I make the task big, that scope is big, then at the end when I'm describing the result, I'm describing the outcome achieved for the entire task, right? So I was thinking that might.
So work backwards from the objective. What is the objective? The objective, what does the interviewer want? The interviewer wants to figure out something. The interviewer wants to figure out how well you troubleshoot. The interviewer wants to figure out how well, you deal under pressure, or how do you deal with delivering bad news, or some kind of a thing. So the question directly goes to what they're trying to figure out. So if you shortchange on the action and the results are the biggest parts of the story. So try not to shortchange on the action. And the action is the one where, that's why if your action was nothing, you were just there, you did a bunch of things and that didn't work, and he was with me, he did a bunch of things and what he did worked, but I'm fully, intimately familiar with all the details. As a part of the interview process, I might just shamelessly borrow a bunch of things that he did versus mix and match what I did with what he did. So first thing is, what if there is no situation? What if there's nothing happens, right? That's super hard. I think you can figure out. If you are a no drama person, then it's going to be hard. But I'm pretty sure you can always, like, a couple of things that I do when I'm actually trying to prepare these stories is that, so this actually helped. So whenever something happens of incident, something happens of importance, right? Something happened and here's what happened, here's this guy, he did this and it completely blew away the entire, like, hardware and whatever else, forgot to take a backup, missed something, didn't log in, right? That's a funny incident. And what we do is that we go and talk about that to everyone who would be actually hearing. Like, anyone who's there. For engineers, that's like a fun thing. Like, I did this and this was like that. And usually when we talk about that, we actually go to an extent of actually narrating. We make it fun, and then some of these stories can translate. So one of the examples that I talk about, like funny stories, was around we have, like, there are tickets that people launch of people file, and then the tickets are essentially things that need immediate attention. They have different severities. There's a SEV one is like high priority or price zero. Different companies use different nomenclature. So site event or SEV is kind of, as sometimes it's referred, is a very common way of looking at it. So one of the high SEV events was essentially saying that we need an administrator to unlock a door. I'm like, why the hell would that be a high SEV event? It doesn't make sense. So the reason why the reason why it relates to star is essentially that you have to make stories out of things that are like nothings at different points of time. Like, that was a high SEV event. Why is it a high SEV event? The next step is that's primarily because it is one of those, like, one of the computers are actually locked behind the wherever the machines were is actually locked by this thing, and we don't have the keys. The engineer tried to reboot the machine. This is like super high priority. We're losing money by the second because that machine is like the gateway between internal and external systems. So it has to be rebooted now. And that's what, now we don't have access to the machine, so we can't reboot it. We can't open the door, so we got to go call the admin. This is like middle of the night, admin is not available. So it's a high SEV event, and it goes all the way to the director of facilities, VP of facilities, and it's like super crazy. So that's the drama, that's the story, that's the suspense and all that. So it turns out that it was a sliding door, and people are trying to pull it open and push it open, and it didn't work. So that's what happened. And that was like, it's a nothing incident, right? But you can always build drama around it. You can always build suspense around it. You can always build like humor around it. And that's what they did. And certain companies do have this thing called, like, SEV reviews, or like, Amazon calls it COE, which is correction of errors. And different companies have different ways of doing it. And this was like every high severity event has to have, like, root cause analysis and figure out how to solve it. So what was the problem? Well, the problem was like an engineer was trying to pull open a sliding door. Okay, what did you do to fix it? It's like, educated the engineer that you need to slide the sliding door.
You don't have a sticker?
That's it. So how are you making sure that this doesn't happen in the future? It's like, oh, we put a sticker with arrows, and that's it. Right? And like, I was just thinking about it, and I actually narrated the story. If I recall correctly, I heard about this incident a couple of years ago, like maybe 6-7 years ago, and I probably told it no less than like 20-25 times. And guess what? It just happened today. Like, a lot of us actually doesn't.
I think everyone who's new to this library try to
Yeah. Everyone, right? I mean, it's not intuitive. The sliding is not an intuitive thing, and it looks like a pull-open door. So I mean, anyway, yeah. So I mean, not like this doesn't, and especially imagine a scenario where it's like already a high severity activity that's going on. You're losing money. Your VP is like screaming at you. Pagers going on. In that tension and everything else, like, you're not looking at the most common answer would probably be, yeah, it's locked. That's why I'm not able to open it. Which is what we did as well, right? You're trying to open the door, it doesn't work, you just go around, try to find a different entrance. Like, you're not trying to, let me solve this thing, let me figure out how to open this, is not what you're trying to do. So, anyway, so the point I'm trying to make is, taking a step back, is that all we're trying to do is figure out like what the drama looks like, and then if the drama is not there, find out how to make it better, and like, add some more color to it. Go ahead.
So I have a question. So, like, here we are interviewing for engineering questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the highest business impact scenario that I have, it is not an engineering, like, I'm not solving a really, it's an engineering problem, but I'm solving a really high business value problem. Is it okay if I note that as well, or do I pick up my second best, but which is?
Fantastic question, and this is not just for engineering versus business, but it's also, if I have a bunch of situations to pick from, which ones I pick? Do I pick the one that has the highest impact, like better results? but probably poorer actions? Or would I pick the one that has better actions and poorer results in the case? Like that's how I see it.
Yeah, not poor results, but
different results,
yeah.
right? Comparatively poorer
Yeah.
results between the
Yeah.
two options, right? So which one do you optimize for? I would actually optimize for action. Primarily because that's the one that's more important from depending on where you are. If you're a VP and interviewing for like a CEO, a CIO, CTO, probably impact us a lot more, but typically for engineers who are interviewing for like middle level management positions even, the actions that you took are a lot more meaningful than that, right? So let me jump quickly ahead. I have a whole lot more. Couple of things in your thing. This is the one where you'll have like mixed messages. In your star story, the star pitch is actually pretty short. So which means that you need to be quick, be complete, like be thorough, but at the same time be succinct. Try not to ramble. So that's why don't make shit up as you go, but actually think about it, practice it, and sharpen it. Just like how we talked about in the resume reviews. You have to be very clear about every word that you say, that you use. Don't use acronyms, don't use industry terms which are actually that people may not know outside the industry, and things like that. The one thing is prepare like about 1.5 times the number of interviews that you'll have as stories. Essentially one-on-one is enough, but 1.5 is primarily just like a few more backups. So if you have like a 6-person interview loop, 6 people interviewing one after another, you have like about 9 stories prepared. Because that's all. You'll have the time to land 1 story per interview, typically, maybe more at some points of time. The other shoe for this one is that what I recommend is land it. You've prepared the story, you've done it, right? Make sure that you're actually landing 1 story each in every interview, even if the interviewer is not asking for something. It's like there are like ways of trying to retrofit what you do into that activity, even if that may not be the meat of why you did that. Like you may have prepared an example for high impact because I did like dive deep and troubleshoot and whatnot, but then you may use it for something else which is different. But that's just ways of rather than actually coming up and inventing your own stories, it might make sense to just reuse what you have. This is the one that I was talking about, right? So why your stories need to be mapped to like favorable behavior. What is the interviewer looking for? Like, can you deliver? Do you demonstrate leadership? Is there teamwork? What's the initiative, as somebody was saying earlier? And like, how are you customer obsessed or whatever else? So that's what we're looking for. Now, just prepare like a short narrative of each one of those and like jog your memory, like numbers, data. We talk about like, hey, it was a 60% deflection. We actually, onboarded like 5% more customers. So that those numbers are important. The fact that it was like 4.5 versus 5 is irrelevant, but you just need to have like, a number in your mind, stick to it, and just don't keep using different numbers at different points of time and things like that. Right? So any questions?
So suppose if you have like different profiles during the period of time, like I worked as a software engineer and then I worked as a teacher and then as a voluntary and some kind of these profiles if I have. So what kind of stories I have for it? Is it like if I'm attending to the software engineering job, I have to go for the software engineering stories, or if I can go for the recent stories which I have been taking in the other profiles?
So the stories actually go back to this, which is the required behavior, desirable behavior. So one of the most common things that I have seen people talk about is like, for example, if you want to talk about conflict, right? Conflict happens, there's a question of, give me an example of when you disagree with your manager, when you actually push back heavily against your whatever powers that be or something like that. That can happen in any job. It doesn't have to be a software engineering job. But if you have an example that actually connects better with the engineering, with the job that you are looking for, then that's preferable because the actions are easier to grok. But that being said, it's okay for the examples to be from other places. Like you're talking about, like, give me an example, like I'm multitasking. What do you want the interviewer to take away after the whole story narrative session? They want to take away that you're smart, you can get the job done, you have demonstrated leadership, you've done, so this is exactly what the message you want to convey. The star story is just a way of getting that message across. So that's the narrative. Now, if you have an example in the same domain that you're actually interviewing for, you want to interview an engineer and you can give engineering examples of where you push back with your manager, a lot more meaningful. But well, if you have like, if you were a teacher before and you push back against the superintendent or supervisor, that's fine too. But it won't land that effectively. But that versus not having a story at all, I think having the story is like infinitely better. So, right?
Couple of questions. So one, when you fit the story, number of stories, does it mean each story reflects a different project? Or for the same project, you can spin it off
So it needs to be, so good question. The question was like, is it different projects or what? This is essentially, your story is like every drama point is a story. So you need to have like as long as you're able to spin that specific activity around like the drama, the suspense and the mystery and everything else, you could have, like, I worked on one particular integration project, and as a part of the integration, I have one drama point as a project manager, a different one with the client, one with the customer, and a whole bunch of different things. So you could always have the same thread, and especially many people that I know work on the same project for their entire 15-year career, 10-year career, and things like that. If you do that, then you don't have the choice, but it'll always be something different. So you can.
As long as we explain, right? Like in the interviews, if we explain that there's something very similar I discussed with your co-worker. I'm reiterating this example, but
So let me repeat that part. Why different stories, right? So the reason why you wanted to have different narratives and different stories to different interviewers is that at later when the people get together and talk, and this is like a more Amazon thing than a Google thing, because in Google they write a package and send out, so there's no discussion. In Amazon, it's more like they sit together and talk. It'll quickly come back like, oh yeah, the same narrative came in my interview, her interview, his interview, and everything else. It just looks like they had only one great thing happen in their life at this point. So maybe not the right kind of person. I need a little bit more color, more diversity of experience and things like that. So that's why even if you pick the same project, you want to pick different incidents. If it's the same dashboard going red incident, I don't want to talk about different drama elements of the same thing. I don't want to talk about that one incident alone, because that's where you're going about the incident, not the project. And you should have enough incidents at least. You should be able to get like 6 or 7 incidents. In a typical interview pool is like 4 or 5 people anyways.
And another question is like, this is a very common question when they ask, where you have taken risk, a calculated risk, or a confrontation. And this could be not related to the technical. It could be anything at work, right?
Primarily, yes.
So if you want to stand out, right? Because everybody would. So is it like if you just talk about something which is not related to the project, and you could just say that I heard somebody harassing someone and I stood up or something along those lines. Would that be advisable?
So short answer is no.
Okay.
There is a longer answer to it. Let me just try it out. So in general, when these questions are asked, they're looking for like consistent behavior patterns and things like that. So you want the interviewer to be able to visualize you in that job facing a similar situation, and they have now a better handle of how you would you're now more predictable and how you react. So the harassment situation is like I'm really not expecting that to happen, so I'm not able to visualize that, right? So that will be a hard thing for you. But if you talk about something else, saying, you know what, I helped unionize the kitchen workers that were actually working in whatever the cafeteria of my company, great leadership, but I can't really imagine that happen here, so I don't know how to map what you've done to what I need, right? So trying to put examples, like if you said you did like a server installation, and I'm able to kind of map that to what I did, what I want. So the goal here is to make the leap so short that the interviewers can actually figure out what you're doing, what you did versus what you can potentially do, right? One more question, go ahead.
So what if interviewer asks a question that we are not doing before, or we don't have any estimate before, and is it okay to just say like, this didn't happen for me, or something like that?
It's yes, please, that's probably the right thing. Most common example, what happens if I don't have an example? Like, give me an example of where you disagree with your boss. If the answer is like never, it's a little hard. If someone with a year or two's of experience, and if you're like an intern or things like that, I can understand that you don't have opportunity to push back. I mean, the interviewer is probably dumb enough to ask that question, because the expectations are mismatched there. But you should have had those experiences, is what the expectation is. When they ask you a question specifically around that format, other common one for managers is like, give me an example of when you have to let go of someone. I've never done that. So that's a reasonable example, but you can say, I've never done that, but I've had an opportunity to work with someone who's actually was low performer. So you're still trying to get to the same story, but not really, because it's a success story. It was not a let go scenario, or it was not really a let go. We turned things around, but he decided that it was still not the right thing for him, so he left on his own accord. So it was not really a firing, but they left. So you could kind of spin a little bit here and there, but if you go back and say, nope, never seen that, nope, never happened, you're just making it harder for the interviewer to map. So try to offer more, right? You had a question.
Okay, in all these questions, the one question that always comes is what innovative thing that you do.
Right.
That you do, So it's not necessary that in my past job I would have done anything innovative. So how do you answer that situation?
So that's where the story building actually comes in handy. I can guarantee that everybody here has done something inventive or innovative in their careers. Doesn't matter what it is. It's essentially creativity is not something vague and weird and impossible and it's only not for few. It's like all of us have actually solved problems in different ways. All of us are actually we are this supercomputer brain that automatically knows how to take inputs, process and do all of that. The thing is that you may not be observant enough to be able to reflect on what you have done and the successes you've had, and that is where I think it helps to chat with your peer group, chat with your colleagues who'll be working with you, to start extracting these stories and talk about the thing. So if you're able to narrate stories, like the 25, 30 times I've talked about the door story is something, it's just, every time it's a little different, every time I've added more color to it, I can actually see how it connects better with people. So I can actually narrate that more effectively, more succinctly. And I can talk about what was the surprise elements and things like that. So I'm sure you'll find innovation, every one of us. I'd actually challenge you, if you haven't, then that'll be challenging. That'll be surprising. All right.
One thing that you can do, again, if you have hard time finding out these stories, just go through your emails and then see where your skip level managers or managers are CC'd or they have replied, or there is a large number of people who are there in the conversation, and then either you contributed or someone else contributed. And stories come out from there.
As the levels go up in the organizations, those are the classic examples of error. So I'm going to hold questions here. We do have, I really want the pitch session as something that's more fun. So what I'll do is I'll stop here with this session. We've got our panelists, so I just wanted to welcome them. So we've got Vidya from My Tech Ladder, and let me see what I have prepped up for you. All right, so as the founder of My Tech Ladder, before this she worked at Agencia, Expedia, Drugstore.com, and essentially My Tech Ladder's vision is to democratize career progression and career mobility for women. So that's fascinating. I think we need to connect more. So what I have a question for you. So just as an example, can you share one of the stories about a time when you drove incredible business value?
Sure. Hi everyone. So business value, I'm going to jump right into the question, right? The situation was back from Expedia Corporate Travel Division. There were mergers and acquisitions happening globally, and I was the director of a team responsible for bringing together 5 development centers. The business value to be driven was very, very much in numbers, right? How do you bring 200 million that the company is spending and effectively replicating the work across 5 development centers, 5 bug tracking systems, 5 continuous integration systems, all of that. How do you bring that down to one globally integrated team that has 1 bug tracking system, 1 continuous integration system, and so on? Rather than thinking about the problem only in terms of dollar value, I took the approach of how do we really think in terms of the people? Their careers, these are individuals involved. We can't just say, let's just take 5 of these teams and make it into one without thinking about the actual people involved. And the real business value driven came out of mapping the individuals based on their skill sets to be landing up in an effective place that still added business value from their new positions. So for example, you may not need SDETs across all of the 5 dev centers anymore. But how do you take some of those SDETs and help them with career progression as well as mobility to either become a product manager or move into customer success or move into an entirely different part of Expedia Inc., which is a larger organization, but really driving. So the action that I was effectively driving was taking a much more people-centric approach rather than pure dollar value, which of course executives always like to see. But by putting that perspective, the whole problem was kind of framed as, okay, this is not just about money, this is about real people, this is about their real stories, and we want to have a good ending for everybody involved. And it became a very easy conversation once we kind of mapped it as, let's make sure everybody lands up in a good situation. And so at the end of it, we did end up with single bug tracking system, single Jenkins instance, all of that, of course, but that was besides the point, right? Nobody was let go. No one from the union had to work with the union in Paris because French laws include some unions are possible if you're not an engineer. So how do you work with the union and still stay within the French law and move people around and yet drive the ultimate business goal, which is, look, we don't want to be spending money unnecessarily. So really keeping both sides of the equation, that it's not just the money, but there's also real people involved, is sort of, I think that's never gone wrong for me. That approach has always worked. And so, yeah, I would definitely say keeping the stories real in terms of, from a star perspective as well, taking that viewpoint has always been helpful.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And if you have some time after the session, like 3:30 onwards, like, if folks have any questions and if you're available, we can just do an individual Q&A or something, right? All right, so next we have Nikhilesh, TPM at Facebook, and previously has worked at Microsoft, Expedia, Adobe, and Ranbaxy in different, like in multiple engineering and product roles. And I believe you've actually heard a lot of these story pitches from different folks. And given that you've recently switched, I think you've also have an experience in making your own pitch. So why don't we actually hear from you? Like, share a story where you had a significant business impact.
Sure. So before I start, I do want to share a little bit of humor.
Sure, go for it.
So I joined Facebook, and a month in, I was on the terrace having beer during a happy hour, and I see this face, and I'm like, I've seen this guy somewhere. And I walk up to him and I say, dude, I've seen you somewhere. And he says, did you interview at Amazon? And this was like just like, a month or two before I joined. And here I see Vivek, like, who was on my interview panel at Amazon.
So I heard
on the terrace, drinking beer along with me. So
in a different company. So
so yeah, so that is a good way to meet him up right there. And then of course we connected on LinkedIn. And then I saw this opportunity coming up here. I said, okay, I'm going to come up and speak about my business impact here. All right, so now diving into this. So here's the situation, right? I was this is 2016 December, very new at Microsoft, my first month in, and oh, I just saw the first lady slide open the door, right? So anyway, first month into Microsoft. And all throughout my career, right, in whatever companies I worked in, I always saw systems that people used, which servers were basically in at least some kind of a data center, right? Could be an on-prem data center, could be like an offshoot data center, but where it was in a data center. So at Microsoft, I walk in and I see these dusty big machines. People are like putting their foot on it. Some people have dustbins on it, right? And I'm like, wow, you guys have a lot of hardware. And I was told, oh, these are our servers. And I was like shocked when I heard that. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, how can you have servers under your foot, right? So eventually that was the model in that team, right? And which was kind of shocking for me. And then it came along with a lot of problems, because there were problems like our operations cost was huge. Like people were like maintaining those boxes, patching them, disk space issues whatsoever, right? We were spending I think up to 60% of our engineering bandwidth on just doing OPSI kind of work, right? And for somebody who likes to build, this is not really the job that I wanted to do. And then there were redundancy issues, right? If those servers were to go down, there was absolutely no backup plan. There were resiliency issues. There were no retries, and those servers were running large data processing jobs, right? I was in the data engineering team. So jobs would fail, and then they would restart from the beginning. There was a lot of loss of compute and stuff like that. And then those were the issues on the ground, right? So the task at hand was to basically go and fix it. And I think the first step in solving a problem is first self-realization that yes, we have a problem, right? And as part of that, I had made up my mind that I had to fix this, right? I just couldn't tolerate sitting there and looking at the servers running like this, right? Customers were like complaining, data jobs would go down, they would never even know that, jobs had gone down, unless, they would come back and say, hey, the data is not there, go look into it, and that's when we would do that, right? So, the task at hand at this point was to go and fix that. And there were a lot of challenges in that, right? Because this was a largely vendor-driven team, so I didn't have an engineering skill set to go and fix something like that. Plus, being new, I had like my own responsibilities that I had come in to, go and fix, right? But I think what really worked in my favor was, one, I understood that yes, there was an issue on the floor. And number two is, I also had an idea on how to fix it, right? So the idea was pretty straightforward. I just applied all my experience from a distributed system computing world that I had done the work back then. And the idea was, break up these very large monolithic jobs into small chunks, with each chunk basically doing one thing and doing it well, right? And at the same time, being able to sequence and, tie all of this together using some kind of a data interchange format, which I did through a message queue system, right? How to do it? I thought I would do it in the cloud. I had no experience of building in the cloud. So my first 3 months, which my fantastic manager there gave it to me, he said, oh, this is your honeymoon period. And I used that to learn Azure and then, sequence all of that together. And I built up some really hacky POC, which there's no way in which I could run that code in production, but it just validated my thought that the idea would work, right? Then came the bigger problem of engineering skill set, right? The engineers that I had on the team, they were all data engineers. They had no experience of, building large-scale distributed systems. So I had an intern who came in, and I was mentoring that intern. This guy was he was a third-year student from Australia, and he was here at Microsoft interning. First week in, and I just realized that this was my opportunity because this guy was brilliant, right? And I knew that if I had to get it done, do it in this 3 months before he leaves and goes back. And I had a different project built out for something to do in fraud detection for him. And I said, okay, we'll do the fraud detection project, but we'll also do this, right? And I set that as the base ground, saying that we'll do this and we'll build the fraud detection project on top of it, right? So next 3 months, I think we spent weekends, we spent crazy hours just working. My son would go for a swim team, and I would go to the library and then work from there over weekends while he would be working from office. But we eventually knocked it out, we got it out. We started off with 10 jobs running every day, and there were some tenets that had said that would be of architecture. I wanted to make it versatile, it had to be in the cloud, it had to be serverless, self-healing, stuff like that, right? So we got all of that accomplished, and when I left Microsoft, we were running over 2,000 data pipeline jobs every day. I was able to cut down my operations cost, that means reduce the vendor headcount, from by around 4 people. It resulted in around $800,000 year-on-year dollar savings. It became a lot more predictable. We had alerting, monitoring, self-healing, and a bunch of these other goodness that came out of it. Net right now, my entire org, which is I think it's around thousands of people, is now using that platform to run all the data pipeline jobs. So, yep, nice. That was the experience, that was the business impact.
Awesome. All right, thank you. All right, and then Sonia, she's a senior manager at AWS, and she's worked at Amazon, and you've been with Accenture prior to that. And in her role, I think you're frequently on the receiving end of effective and ineffective pitches from what I hear. So, can you share with us a situation that represents one of your biggest wins?
Sure. So, hi everybody, I'm Sonia. I'm a senior manager at AWS, like Vivek mentioned. I actually recently moved over to AWS in the past few months. Prior to that, I was actually working on the .com side at Amazon in transportation for almost 4 years. I worked on a procurement team, so in that team, we basically run all the contract negotiations with your large carriers in North America, so your UPSs, your USPSs, your FedExes, and that kind of thing. So I spent a lot of time working with carriers on negotiating how to improve the business from an Amazon perspective as well as from their perspective. So I have quite a bit of experience hearing ideas and hearing pitches from the other side. and actually giving them, because believe it or not, it's not always the carrier actually pitching ideas to us, it's actually us pitching ideas to them too about how we want to change our business. So I'm going to actually be a little bit vague with some of the things that I'm talking about, because I think that you're recording, so I won't go into it to a ton of detail. But one of the experiences that I've actually had pitching an idea was the team would do a lot of analysis on our metrics and looking at basically like cost per package and average speed of a package from our fulfillment centers to a customer's home. So we would always kind of be doing deep dives. We would also look at places where we were actually kind of above averages, and what we would do is we kind of like hone in on those areas and try to come up with root causes as to why that's happening. So as we do that, many times we actually come up with or think about, do we need to actually look at the carriers that we're working with today and think about maybe going back to the table on rates and that kind of thing, or do we actually come up with potentially other solutions? So the situation in this one was that we were doing that deep dive. We noticed there was kind of a region that we were spending a bit more. Packages were taking more time to reach the customer's home. So we looked at it and we said, okay, we think the best thing to do at this point is to actually figure out how we can maybe come up with alternative ways to ship. As you all know, this is pretty public. Amazon has built out a huge fleet of planes and trucks and all kinds of jazz there. So we can look at how to leverage basically our own solutions internally to kind of meet a better cost per package and average delivery speed. So task was go out and kind of create a new solution, which was actually really neat, because that was a pretty big exposure for me to have to go to kind of sit with leadership and talk about a new inventive way to do things. So I had to work with a ton of teams. We went out and sourced carriers, had to kind of go through new contract negotiations, and basically built a brand new way to ship. So you can imagine that's partnering with a bunch of different tech teams, a bunch of different operations teams around the company, partnering with a carrier, right, coming up with like building a relationship with a carrier that we may have not have had exposure to, all with the intent that we would save, roughly $15 million in savings over the course of the year, and then increase shipping by a day. So that was neat. It was a good experience for me. It turned out kind of the way that I outlined. For me, I guess in terms of pitches, I think you always kind of want to think about the receiving end of it, right? So as you're making a pitch, I think you always want to be able to communicate what does this cost, right? So like, what does your idea cost, or like, what are the savings involved in my case? How long is it going to take? I think that's always one of the first questions people have is, oh, that sounds great. Is that going to take you like 3 months, or is it going to take you a year? So giving some sort of like timeline as to like what that effort is. What's in it for me? I think that's like the biggest thing. You want to make sure as you're trying to gain buy-in on things that you're communicating the value prop right to the receiving end. I think you also want to address like, why is this not a good idea? Like, why should I not agree to something like this? There's always risks involved in any idea. And I think you need to be transparent about that. I think that's the way of building trust. And that's the way of gaining buy-in into an idea, is basically telling the truth and saying, not everything's rosy, right? So being forthcoming about that. And then the last one is, what do you need from me, right? So you're pitching an idea to someone, a team, whoever it is. You're doing that because you need their buy-in for a certain reason. So I think also being transparent, like you need support from their teams, you need resources, you need funding. Again, I think being forthcoming with that information as you think about pitching is really important.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so what we'll do is, after this, we have, I think the presentation took a little longer, I apologize for that. So what we'll do is, the questions is skipped. So, next steps. You should have this sheet. If you don't have one, just please collect it. It's here, or somebody should have extra copies. What we do is pick one of these 3 questions. The questions are actually listed on the sheet, and then write down your answer. And then what we'll have is we'll take about 15 minutes or so. 2:45 is when we'll start the pitches. So I want folks to sign up to come and provide the pitch, and then our panelists will actually review the pitch and provide instant feedback in terms of like, hey, your story was good, not so good, what was good and what's not so good, all right? And then I'll see if you guys can take some notes or something, and then we can hand in the notes to them. So that way you have more can be on the notes. We'll also be recording the pitch, so that way you and I'll share it with you. So if you want to hear your pitch afterwards and see how it happened, reflect on it, you can do that. So we will reconvene in about like 11 minutes or so, and then we can get back. So think about your pitches.